Good evening and welcome to the Book Club of California for our in-person and online program titled Nut Tree, From a California Ranch to a Design, Food, and Hospitality Icon. Thank you all for joining us here in the club rooms, again, for your patience. We have a small but mighty group here in the club rooms, but we do have about 125 people who have registered to attend this Zoom program. So welcome if you're joining us on Zoom. If you're new to the Book Club of California, we are a member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books. We have a scholarly journal and we have keepsakes. We host a year-round series of programs and exhibitions like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. So if you're not a member or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, we ask you to consider joining our century-long tradition by becoming a member or a donor. You can visit us online at bccbooks.org to find out more about the book club or to join. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. Again, the program is titled Nut Tree, From a California Ranch to a Design, Food, and Hospitality Icon. And our presenter is author and fifth generation member of the founding family of the Nut Tree, Diane Power Zimmerman. Now, along with her 5 siblings and 11 cousins, Diane Power Zimmerman began work at age 12 in the toy shop at Nut Tree. She subsequently worked in every department there. After graduating from the University of California, Davis, she became an assistant manager for Nut Tree's fast food concept restaurant called the Coffee Tree. A year later, she enrolled in a 2-year graduate program at the University of the Pacific and then pursued a successful career as a speech pathologist, educator, and a school administrator. Mid-career, she obtained a PhD in organizational development from the Fielding Graduate Institute. And after 36 years in public education, she retired as superintendent of schools and launched her second career as an author. She has since co-authored 5 books on educational leadership. Now, tonight, Diane Power Zimmerman will share highlights from her book, Nut Tree, From California Ranch to a Design, Food, and Hospitality Icon. As the oldest granddaughter of the founders of a famous Northern California roadside destination called the Nut Tree, many of you have been there, our speaker is uniquely positioned to tell the story of this 20th century icon. Now, Diane Power Zimmerman's book, which we have here at the front of the room, and you can come and look at it, and we'll be sharing with you online how you can find out more and acquire that book, but it draws from family records, letters, newspaper clippings, photos, and the extensive archives of the Vacaville Museum. And it creates a visually stunning tribute to her family's business. She will also reflect on the writing experience and tell us how telling this interesting story took on a life of its own. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We'll have time towards the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the chat and the Q&A on Zoom and here in the club rooms from you all. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, author, and 5th generation member of the founding family of the Nut Tree, Diane Power Zimmerman.
Thank you. That was lovely. I'm actually really thrilled to be here tonight because my father, Robert H. Power, who was one of the owners of Nut Tree, was a Book Club of California book member for many, many years. And so it's really nice to be here. And it was actually my sister who ran into Kevin at an antiquarian book fair down in Pasadena and suggested that he get me to speak. So it was kind of that book connection that got me here. And so I'm going to dedicate my speech tonight to my father. His name was Robert H. Power. He was known as Bob by everybody that knew him, but his formal name was Robert H. Power. And I am going to be telling you a little bit about, my talk tonight is going to tell you a little bit about the history of the nut tree and how it came to be, but I'm going to really focus on the food because that was actually what my father contributed to the business. The book actually tells about design and hospitality and a whole bunch more, but I don't have time to get into that. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about what I learned as a self-publisher, because I self-published this after working with publishers for my other publications. If you can't hear me and you're in the room, just put your hand up because sometimes I start to get lower. So anyway, my father, as I mentioned, was a lover of books. And I can still remember as a young child dreading these trips to San Francisco because he always disappeared into the antiquarian bookstores just down the street and around the corner on Post Street. Warren Howell is the only name I can remember now at this time. I see somebody waving. And I wish I could go back in time and revisit those places because, as you all know, those were amazing antiquarian bookstores and they were full of treasures that we would love. But as a small young person, I didn't fully appreciate it. But he did give the gift of love of books to all of his children. And so all of us are some kind of collectors of books of some kind. In another time, my father would have probably become a professor and gone on to college to study history because he loved California history. And he spent almost all of his free time studying. When he wasn't being a father and a restaurateur, he studied California history, and he spent a lot of time traveling the world, talking to people in particular about Sir Francis Drake. That became his passion, the puzzle about where his landfall was. And he spent time looking at maps and dealing with all the different things that happened. He really did the equivalent of a doctorate in this area, but he had an AA degree from City College here in San Francisco. So he really couldn't become a professor. He was a restaurateur, and he was kind of foisted into it because he was born into the family and they were a working family. So every single one of them started working as soon as they could walk. They were helping their family with the business. And he ended up being the middle child. So he didn't really get a choice about what he was going to do. His older brother, Ed Power, was my uncle, and he really followed his father around. And his father, Bunny, was a very talented artist, a craftsman, a fabricator. He came from a family of fabricators, and so he could make anything. He was a talented marketer, and he was very able to take care of the farm. He did all of the management of what we called Nut Tree Ranch. And Ed followed his father and learned all of that. My Aunt Mary Helen, who was the youngest daughter, she followed my grandmother, Helen Power, around and learned how to make flowers, learned how to manage the business, the employees, how to do payroll, all of the things that you need to do to keep a business afloat. And so she easily slipped into the role that her mother held. And the one role that still wasn't filled was the two aunts. I had two aunts that never married. It turns out that the restaurant, it was a woman-run business until the food part was women-run until 1948. Now, don't get me wrong, there were men in the kitchen, but they were all Chinese cooks. At that time, no Caucasian men would work in kitchens. It was beneath them. And so we had immigrants that did dishes, and we had Chinese that came from San Francisco that has a long tradition of cooks from this city that came and cooked for our restaurant for the entire time, 75 years. Well, maybe not the first 3 years, but my Aunt Edith and Jewel were the cooks. Their mother was a great cook. They learned to cook. And so they took care of the cooking part of it, making salads and the breads and the mayonnaise, and they made everything from scratch. So they needed somebody to take over from Edith and Jewel, who were the same. They were older than my grandmother, and they were ready to retire. So they appointed my father when he came back from World War II to come down here to San Francisco to City College and to take 2 years of a restaurant program so that he could come back and run the food operation. So when he came back after 2 years, he was the first male to have any kind of responsibility in management at the Nut Tree and in the food. Now, there were men in everything else, but not in the food. And it's kind of interesting because he ended up loving that part of his job, and it was never really an issue. And I wish he was alive. He died in 1991. So it was before the business even closed. I wish he was alive because I'd love to ask him, how did you feel about kind of being told that was going to be your job, you know? But he was probably, and when I wrote this book, people told me he was probably the most creative of the family. I think he was also probably the craziest of all of them too. He was a pretty zany guy, and was always had more ideas than he could ever possibly do in this life. So here's the tribute to, well, why is it not going forward?
All of our technology is failing us.
Uh-oh,
I got it.
you got it?
Yeah. Yep, you hold on to that.
Oh, okay.
There you go.
Oh, okay, thank you. So here it is, dedicated to my father. And he was a historian because he loved that. He was a rare book and a map collector, and he was a restaurateur. And this is a picture of him speaking in the Nut Tree dining room to the California Historical Society, which I'll tell you about when we get to the food. So he not only did he participate in all these different organizations, he was always doing public speaking, whether it was in classrooms or to groups like that. So now I'm going to give you a little backstory about how Nut Tree came to be. In 1852, my great-great-grandfather, Josiah Allison, came from Iowa looking for gold. He got here a little late and he didn't find much gold. He got a little bit, but not very much. If you know anything about the gold rush, it was starting to wane about that time. But he fell in love with the weather in California, and he decided to go home through the Panama Canal. Crazy going home to Iowa, but that's what they did. And he came through Solano County, which is all the miners had to do if they went home through Panama Canal. And Solano County was beginning to grow fruit at that time. And he fell in love with not only the weather of California, but he tasted peaches from California. And he decided he was coming back to farm and grow peaches. So literally he went home, and 2 years later arrived back in California with 5 kids, 6 kids actually when he arrived, because one was born on the trail in Nevada. And amazing, because she just picked up and kept going. And then my great-great-grandmother was born here in California, which is how I get to be a 5th generation Californian. So anyway, he came to Vaca Valley. He was late to Vaca Valley and ended up with some property that was right on the immigrant trail, but it wasn't considered the best property in the area because everybody had bought the hill property. It was a little easier to farm in those years because there was a little more water in those hills and more shade and things like that. And but he, the property, put in wells, and became a successful farmer. It turns out that Solano County became ground zero for farming in California, and all of the fruit that is grown in the state had its genesis just about in Solano County. Pears, cherries, apricots, peaches, you name it. It was grown. Kiwis later was all grown in Solano County. It all started there, so it was a pretty big, popular area at that time. The problem is that you could grow more fruit than you could sell. There weren't enough people in California to eat the fruit. This is not our ranch. This is the Bradford Ranch, but it was the best picture I could find of the bounty. And you can see that those trees are loaded with peaches, and that wagon is loaded with peaches. And so they had a problem because they didn't know what to do with all the fruit. And they could ship it down here to San Francisco, but there weren't enough people here to take it all. They could dry it, but there weren't enough people to buy all the dried goods. There were no factories, so they didn't have cans or glasses until almost the turn of the century, so they couldn't bottle or can it. And so they struggled in those early years with these crops because they really had too much. And it was the great boon that came was the railroad. But in the meantime, Josiah became an old man. He farmed here for 30 years, and he decided he was done. And he sold the ranch to his youngest daughter, the one Hester, who was born here. She had just married a young man from Wisconsin who was a farmer, and they decided to take over the ranch, and the young man's uncle owned property next door. So it became a one big joint ranch. So, and it turns out that Luther Harbison, who was the person who married Hester Allison, so we now Hester and Luther Harbison were running the farm, and Luther was a transcendentalist. So he very much believed that his wife was an equal with him, and had very different ideas than, most of he wasn't not Christian, but he didn't go to any of the churches in Vacaville. And but he was very entrepreneurial. He worked with the USDA and worked on all kinds of different crops and different kinds of things on the Nut Tree property, what became the Nut Tree property. It was 150 acres. And when they started being able to ship the fruit to the East Coast, all these farmers got rich. So if you go to Vacaville, there's a strip of houses on the main street that are big. Buck Mansion, the Buck family, by the way, got their start in rail and the ice business, and in refrigeration cars. And so one of the original Buck houses is right there on Main Street in Vacaville. And my family, my great-grandfather had enough money to be able to build this house. And those of you that have had the good fortune to go to Nut Tree would have seen this house. You would have never visited it because my great-grandmother and my two spinster aunts lived in it until they died. So there was somebody living in this house until the 1970s. And so it's really never really open to the public because of that. The house is still there, and it's unfortunately sitting empty behind the shopping center that has moved into that property now. And sadly, it was moved, and it's hard to restore heritage property, but when it's been moved off of its foundation. So it's languished for the last 15, 20 years. But a beautiful house. There's a whole story behind the house. Don't have time to go into tonight, but it shows that they were really doing well at that time. The problem was Luther Harbison is the gentleman in the middle, and his wife Hester is the woman on the left. And he had 4 daughters and no sons, and he was a farmer. So he, being a transcendentalist, that didn't bother him too much. He gave each daughter a job. Edith, who is not in this picture, I'm not sure where she was at that time, loved horses. So she took over the animals in the horse barn, and she was in charge of all the spray rigs. And yeah, they did use pesticides and things to kill insects in those years too. And then Jewel, who's the woman on the far left, went to UC Berkeley and majored in horticulture. And she became the person in charge of all the grafting and the horticulture, the growing kinds of things. The woman in the middle is Eleanor, and she also went to UC Berkeley, graduated, and she married the man sitting in front. This is right before they got married. And his name was Jim Masson. She never came back to the ranch when she left. She was basically not in the story anymore. The other 2 women stayed on the ranch and ended up being the 2 people that I talked about that became cooks for the Nut Tree. And then my grandmother is the one with her arm around her mother, Helen, and she was the baby in the family. And she just loved her father, but I think she was also worried about her father. Her father started suffering from tuberculosis, and he had a long, slow decline from the tuberculosis, but as you know, it cripples you over time. And I think as a small child, she worried about him and followed him around just to make sure he was okay. And of course, he delighted in that, and he taught her everything he knew about ranching. So when he was hospitalized around this time in 1913, she was 20 years old, and she took over management of the ranch. She just started bandaging all the men, everything that needed to be done. And he wrote in his letters later when he was in the sanitarium, because that's where he ended up dying in Weimar. He wrote, "I never figured that my smallest, most petite daughter would be so strong," and I get goosebumps when I tell you this, "so strong and so capable. I didn't offer it to her, she just took it, and it needed to be done." So, but all of 3 of those women and Hester, their mother, were amazing women. So was Eleanor, but she didn't stay with the business. They all contributed to the business and helped develop it. And, other than the problem with the tuberculosis, we're a pretty happy family. So my grandmother didn't go to college because she got busy taking care of the ranch, but she was a lifelong learner. And she decided to take correspondence classes in how to do management. So some of the papers I went through were calendars from her correspondence class. And she also decided she needed to learn how to prune because she was supervising men who were pruning. So she went to what was called the Ag Extension at that time for Berkeley, but it was the property that became UC Davis, and took a pruning class. And while she was there, she dropped a $10 bill and was very distressed about losing that much money in those days. And a nice young man by the name of Edwin I. Power, otherwise known as Bunny because of his big ears, found the $10, turned it in, and they hit it off. And it was really love at first sight. Within 3 months, he had proposed to her. Within 5 months, they had decided to lease the property from Hester because it was clear that Luther was not coming back to work on the farm. And within 11 months, they were married. And then that next January, Luther passed away. So they really did need the man. My grandmother often says, "I'm so glad I didn't become an old maid like my sisters because we needed a man." So farming's hard work. It was not easy at that time. You got to remember that gas engines didn't really come in. My grandmother took a gas engine class, by the way, small engine class, just started happening in 1918. So anyway, so they are newlyweds, and they are living on the Nut Tree Ranch, trying to build a house. They had nothing. They were penniless. And the crop had a problem, very much like this year. We had a late frost. They had a late frost, and it means that your bloom is reduced. So your production is reduced. And then we had a heat wave earlier. They had a heat wave. We did this year too. And so it means that they couldn't ship that fruit because it got too ripe. See, there's a sweet spot in fruit. And if you can measure the sugar, as soon as the sugar sets in a piece of fruit, you can pick it. And it's not as good as if you leave it on the tree, except for pears, but it's almost as good. So it ripened too quick and they couldn't ship it. It was kind of a disaster for this young couple because they had taken a bank loan to buy this or take the lease out for with the family, with Hester. And so the family got together, and Hester had been to Los Angeles and she had seen them peddling, nuts and oranges on the side of the road. And she says, well, maybe we should try that. My grandfather did not want his wife peddling any fruit, but she was very suasive and said, we have no choice, Bunny, we're selling fruit. So he set up a fruit stand, and you see on the far left is it's the biggest shade tree, happened to be on the Immigrant Highway, which turned into the Lincoln Highway, which turned into Highway 40 and turned into Interstate 80. There's a reason why the nut tree was on top of the freeway. It was built on the freeway from day one. That was a problem, by the way, when they sold it, because the city wanted them to make roads and make more room for streets. So anyway, it was a very primitive little stand. It was just prune trays. They thought it would last one season. He put a rocking chair and a Saturday Evening Post out because he thought she'd be sitting a lot. My grandmother never sat down. Within a week, she put Edith, her sister, to work. Within 2 weeks, Jewel was working. Both of them were working full time, because it turned out America had fallen in love by 1921 with the automobile. And there was nothing on the open road. They were gravel roads mostly, and there was nothing out there. The people in Vacaville laughed at my grandfather for putting anything out there on that road, because nobody goes out of town to do business. It's all done in town. Well, it turns out when you have an automobile, it's hot. You need to get out of it from time to time. You need water to drink unless you bring it with you and it gets hot. You need water for your radiator. That was a big issue in those days. And you get hungry because you can't get out of the Bay Area like you can today. It would take you several hours to get to Nut Tree. Unlike today, I got here in 55 minutes because I had no traffic. Miracle. So anyway, they soon my grandfather said, well, we've got a business here. We're not going to let this one go. So that winter they went to town, got another bank loan, and built their very first small one-room restaurant and put Edith and Jewel to work cooking. My grandmother started managing, and my grandfather basically kind of took care of everything else. He did all the marketing. He was an artist. His family were artists. And so he really knew how to package things, and he knew a lot about marketing. So the business grew. And by 1936, this picture here, it post dates 1936, but in 1936, Duncan Hines, who we know as the baking company, he actually was a traveling salesman, and he traveled the country. And at that time, restaurants were a little dicey, and some of them were not safe. You get sick, there were problems with them. So he decided for a Christmas gift one year to put together his top 400 restaurants. It's not quite 400, I don't remember the number, and make a little booklet for his friends. Well, it went viral, whatever viral is in those days. And the next year he was publishing his book of the top restaurants in the US, and Nut Tree was in the very first book and was in one ever after. And he called it Adventures in Good Eating. Well, my grandfather was big on marketing. So you see here the tribute to their Duncan Hines recognition with Adventures in Good Eating. And by the way, Duncan Hines also inspected kitchens. So it became kind of a norm for people to go into kitchens to look at kitchens, because you could tell if it was clean and whether you wanted to eat there if you went to the kitchen. So that was another little piece of lore that I learned in writing the book. What you see here is kind of a primitive building that my grandfather built pretty much from scratch himself. All of the bricks were adobe bricks. He made them right there on the ranch. We had a lot of adobe soil. Didn't cost him anything. In the first couple of years, he used eucalyptus for the upright beams. He had to buy some lumber from town for the horizontal beams. And he loved succulents. And so really, if you got close to this building, it looked like something you'd find in Los Angeles, San Diego, New Mexico, Arizona. We didn't use much adobe other than maybe in the Mission times, and San Jose has quite a bit of it still. But we had so much wood here in California, and it was much faster to build with wood. So people didn't and our weather was such, we didn't really need that adobe. But the Nut Tree had this adobe. And if you visited it, you walked over all these old adobe bricks when you went into that dining room, and the little beer bar was still the adobe structure. So that structure stayed till the day it was ripped down, but it got built around. So it's kind of interesting. And then in the 50s, the nut tree hired a designer in 1953. He self-selected, but that's a story you have to read the book to find out. And he started working with the family on the design functions. They were always doing design. My father and my grandfather and my uncle were artists in their own right. And he began to work with them on redoing buildings. But my uncle Ed really started the first modernization. He built his own house based on case study houses. He built a house to help my grandparents pick out a plan that turned out to be a model from case study houses. My aunt ended up in one. We ended up in an Eichler house. By 1953, 3 of the 4 families were all living in kind of case study houses. And case study houses, if you don't know, are houses that we call California modern, with the big plate glass windows and the sliders and flat roofs and all of that. There's a whole section in the book about the case study houses. So it was really Ed that brought modernity to the nut tree. But Don Burrell was attracted to the nut tree because of the modernity, and he came in and put the frosting on the cake. And he suggested, he was a Sacramento man, and he suggested we hire Dreyfus and Blackford, and they came in and redid the nut tree. So most of you, unless you're very, very old, will remember mostly the modern. It became the first experience that Northern California residents had of modernity, because we had the big plate glass windows, the gardens that were inside, outside, all of this kind of look that was totally different. And my central question in my book actually became, how did this happen? How did we go from these 2 first pictures to this kind of glass castle in a way? It wasn't quite a glass castle, but there was something like that was totally different. And to be honest with you, a lot of restaurants look like the middle picture. The Milk Farm down the road, many people remember, they were a dairy, and so they sold the best ice cream for a long time until Nut Tree decided to compete, but that was another story. And back in the New England, they had cranberry, restaurants, and we have Knott's Berry Farm. They all kind of look like this, kind of low strung, hung buildings that were just a good place to get a meal, get a good solid meal. And somehow the Nut Tree did this metamorphosis and just turned into this amazing place that most people, if you've never been there, you can't describe it to people. They just look at you like, what? And so I decided that that was the thesis of this book. I needed to figure out for myself and for the world, how did this happen? Because it just didn't happen in a vacuum. It was 75 years of really, really hard work. So that was the central question. And once I had that question, I realized that the narrative of the book was going to be about my grandmother, Helen, amazing human being. It was her family that came. It was her grandfathers that started the farm. She married Bunny, and then they had 3 children. So the second part of the book is about her and Bunny's marriage and what they did to build this middle restaurant. The next part of the book is about the 3 kids, Ed, Bob, my father, and Mary Helen, and each one of them was design, food, and hospitality. So there you have the central core. And they were challenged by their parents to take what their parents had done and make it even better. And I can't tell you, it gives me goosebumps thinking about what they all did. They just went crazy. My uncle built the airport. My aunt did all these other things. And, the employees adored my aunt. And we had people that worked at our restaurant from the time they were 17 until they couldn't work there anymore, until it closed. I mean, huge dedication from the employees. So it was a pretty amazing place to be. Anyway, so that's pretty much what I was trying to do and how I kind of got into this writing thing. Now I'm going to shift and say a little bit about what my father and the food at the Nut Tree and why it was so unique. The Nut Tree basically started out, my grandmother actually said, we knew nothing about doing a restaurant or about having any kind of food. We didn't know what we were doing. So we just asked the customers what they wanted. And I remember asking my grandmother when I was a kid, well, what did you serve? And she'd say, oh, well, we would make olive sandwiches and egg sandwiches. And well, it was whatever they wanted, the customer wanted. And that's what they did. Well, what was interesting about it is customers brought them things then. When the customer found out they were going to be listened to, they brought them things. So when I was writing the book, I went through a box of Edith's things. She was the oldest sister who was the cook. She had more salad dressing recipes than you could shake a stick at. But the Nut Tree was famous for their salad dressings, especially marshmallow dressing. If you like that marshmallow dressing, you can find the recipe on the internet, and the Vacaville Museum sells a cookbook with it in it. But that's another story that I'll come back to. But the very first food item that was of distinction was this tamale that became known as the Nut Tree tamale. It was made by a family in the Vallejo in the 1920s. And my family bought it from this family. And it was a beautiful specimen. I like to call it a surprise ball. It was big. You could hold it in your hand like this. And it was wrapped, each layer had a piece of masa or masa spirit on it. And then the stew was in the very, very middle. And in the very, very middle was a delicious green olive. And so the customer came and the waitress would cut they were all women waitresses, by the way, would cut the strings and then show you how to start unwrapping it. And then you would unwrap it, scrape the masa off, and you would then enjoy this amazing Spanish delicacy. It was really from Mexico, but they called it Spanish at that time. It turns out Herbert Hoover, after he was president, used to go through the area a lot, always stopped at the nut tree. In 1931, he had one of these tamales. When the family went out of business in Vallejo, my family just started making them themselves. They made everything from scratch. If you're fabricators, you just think you can make anything in the world you need. So the nut tree, it turns out this was one of the #1 selling restaurant items all the way through its existence. I found food counts in 1990, and it was still the top seller on the menu. So pretty amazing. And it was not anything like that flat pack tamale. It tasted a little bit like it, but that you can mostly buy now that we call it tamale. And you see on the other side that when Don Burrell came, he started helping my father design plates and started what we now in restaurants call plating, but at the time it was unknown. And what you do is you place food on a plate so it becomes a work of art. And that's an image from the menu, but it shows you the plating. So this is a picture of Bunny and Helen, Helen and Bunny, I should say. And my grandfather was a master at packing dried fruit. He was artistic and he could do in candy, anything he could do. One day he got the idea he was going to put all the fresh fruit from the ranch and the area on a plate and serve it as a fruit salad. Duncan Hines made a big deal about salads at Nut Tree. I told you they were into salad dressing, and they were into farm goods. So they had massive salads even before they became the food we knew. And so my grandfather made this fruit plate. And my father took that and perfected it. And then Don Burrell came and put an artistic flair to it. So it evolved over time into this gorgeous plate that had an orchid from Hawaii. And we started bringing in fruit from Hawaii. So we had fruit all year round. My family disdained anything canned. The only thing canned they ever used were pickles. They didn't make their own pickles, mustard, ketchup, all the mayonnaise, everything else was made from scratch. And my father, by the time he was in 1976, was elected president of the National Restaurant Association in Chicago. So that's a pretty big honor. It's the whole, the umbrella organization for restaurants. A little controversial now because it's really business owners that own it. So all the workforce issues are problems. But at the time, it was a really big deal. We all flew to Chicago and drove in limousines and the whole thing. There's a picture of my father when this is the program for his ceremony. But the reason I want to pay tribute to him tonight, and I really didn't fully appreciate it till I wrote the book, he is the first person to talk about California cuisine. It wasn't 30 years later when they started talking about it in Berkeley. He was talking about it. He grew up with that tamale. He grew up with Chinese cooks, and I'll show you a little bit of their influence in a minute. And he grew up with food, farm food. And they disdained canned fruit, and they would not do anything with canned fruit at that restaurant. And so he went to the East when he was in the Army, then he went to France, and then he was in England. Now, he didn't eat in any fine restaurants, I'm sure, but he would have paid attention to food because my family were always out stealing ideas from anywhere they could find them. And he came back knowing that food in the rest of the world was different than what he had grown up in California. And he decided that it was called Western food. He didn't call it California, he called it Western. And Sunset at the time was promoting Western living. And Sunset came to visit in 1948. And it was that night that my father came up with this definition, which is that Western food is pioneered by the Nut Tree as truly representative of California dining. It's shaped by the climate, we already know that, tempered by many nationalities. That is not something that was realized in Berkeley immediately. When Alice Waters started, she was based on France. And I'm not panning her. She's an amazing human being, and she's really spawned a lot of restaurants. It was other people like Mark Miller that brought the ethnicity to the California cuisine, and who worked with her. But it's tempered. It was improved by ingenuity, and it's packed with history, color, and the flavor of the Pacific Northwest. He really could have put the flavor at the Pacific Rim. That would have been a little more appropriate probably at that time, but he didn't really realize it. But this is a definition you could use today for California cuisine. and even more than it would have been in 1970 when they first coined those terms. So really visionary in what he was thinking. Here's a little bit about how my dad thought that was visionary. I got to keep an eye on time. He loved Hester Harbison's bread. She was an excellent cook. Actually, she made all the butter for Vacaville and had a second business running making butter. It was the best butter in town because she figured out how to pasteurize it by putting it on the back burner of her stove and heating it overnight. So it didn't spoil. Didn't know what she was doing, but that was what happened. And the bread that she baked was in big loaves, and it was like Wonder Bread in the middle, but it had a nice crust on the outside. And you couldn't slice it till it had cooled a little bit because it was too soft. But as soon as that bread cooled, man, you'd slice that stuff up and it was just delicious. They couldn't use it in the restaurant very effectively because it had no preservatives. And when you use that kind of flour, if you are a baker, you know that whole wheat flours last longer in a loaf of bread than this white flour. So it would start to get stale the minute you cut the thing. So they really had struggled trying to use any kind of bread, Hester's recipe. My father came up with the brilliant idea, I'm just going to make little loaves and they don't have to cut the loaf until the customer has it in front of them. So he basically couldn't find pans. So of course they're fabricators. He had the metal shop that his father used for all the display cases in town making pans that fit that. He went shopping for little breadboards and found them at Sears Roebuck. And he found a little serrated knife and he brought them back and he stamped nut tree with the wood burner on every one of those breadboards. We sold thousands of those breadboards and thousands of those knives and thousands of those little loaves of bread. And he started serving that with every diner that came. Bread wasn't often served. And if you lived in California, bread started being served at every meal. It's being taken away now for cost reasons and also because of diet reasons. But they were one of the first people to make bread like a course or an offering. Well, now he needed to figure out how to make sandwiches out of this bread. And he was a great lover of picnics. So one day he decided to make a picnic on a plate and he created something called a vagabond sandwich. And what a vagabond sandwich was all the things you need to make a sandwich, but it wasn't put together. It was deconstructed. And he then served the bread. You slice your little piece of bread. You can see there's mustard and mayonnaise and that beautiful butterfly. This is after Don Burrell was there. So we have this nice decorative stuff on the plate and the way it's arranged is just beautiful. And these were the #1 lunch items for years. Everybody that came to lunch ordered one of these vagabond sandwiches. And again, we're very unusual. You didn't find that in other people. In fact, I like to say when Wayne Thiebaud was painting the classic club sandwich, which is your stack sandwich, my father was constructing them and making these vagabond sandwiches. They did sell a club sandwich at the Nut Tree that looked like Wayne's thing. Then the other thing that happened is my grandmother, I mentioned, was a florist. So they were farmers. So they were always going down to the farm, the flower market and the produce market here in San Francisco. And when the airplanes started coming in from Hawaii, they started bringing these pineapples over. And my grandparents went down they were buying pineapples to use on their fruit plates. And they went down to Central America because my family were into farm. So they like to make sure it was picked at the right time, because if you pick fruit, as I mentioned, at the wrong time, it's deadly. And so they went to Central America to look into pineapples and discovered that in Central America, they served them as like on plates, and they were often in the hull, so decoratively served. And they came back and reported to Bob that that's how they had seen them. Well, my dad there's a picture in one of the old books that he had that showed them bringing pineapples. Pineapples lasted for a long time, so they would take them home to Europe and they would use them as decorations. They couldn't eat them, but if they picked them green, they would last 18 months. And so they'd give them to all the kings and the queens and everybody, and there's pictures of them being presented, and so he didn't want any like little thing that's quartered and laying sideways. He wanted something that looked like those pictures. So he put the pineapple, deconstructed it again so it's easy to take apart, and put it on a breadboard or a board and put the top on, got that marshmallow dressing that they had already served at the Nut Tree, and started serving that. And it became the first thing when you came to dinner, the first thing you always got was ice water, because that was from the early days. Customers loved that ice water. And the second thing that came when you came for dinner was this pineapple on a platter with the marshmallow. And to this day, everybody says that marshmallow dressing was their favorite thing. And next door to that, you see the fruit plate that I mentioned before. My dad added the sherbet to it, or you could get cottage cheese, and he added nut bread to it. So that is an example. And this is after Don Burrell came, and they had pictures in the restaurant of how to put these together for the women that made them. And they taught you to rotate colors. You never put the same colors next to each other, and you went for contrast. So it was an art form in itself. So now here's the last little story I have about my dad and how creative he was. He was always pushing California products. And one of the things he was trying to push was rice. And nobody in California liked rice at that time. We were baked potato eaters with the European tradition. But the Chinese cooked rice, and it turned out that at the back door, they called it the hobo kitchen. Every day at 4 o'clock, they rang a bell, and everybody that wanted to eat from the whole ranch and everything would go to that back door. And the Chinese cooks would make a lot of stir fries for the family with white rice. My father adored white rice. He rarely ever ate a baked potato. My mom was Irish, so she ate the baked potatoes, but my dad liked the rice. And anyway, he one day decided to put chicken almond on the menu and to serve it with rice. It wasn't served quite this beautifully the first time, and it became another hit. And again, this would be very unusual for Americans because they didn't eat Chinese food unless they came to San Francisco, to Chinatown, but most people aren't doing that. And lo and behold, with the stir fry over the top, bland by our things, it had snap peas and, some bamboo shoots and celery and stuff like that, but it was a very bland sauce. But when you put it with the rice, oh my God, people loved it. And all of a sudden they liked the rice and they were eating his rice. He was thrilled. Don Burrell came, and one of the people working there said, "Hey, Don, this plate is kind of bland. Do you think you could dress it up?" And he came up with the idea of putting the cut orange. They cut thousands of those little orange flowers out, putting the orange around it, and then that beautiful red chopstick, and it just made it a wow presentation. This was the #2 bestseller on that 1990 list. So it lasted all the way in. Now, the other thing my father tried to serve was wheat, California wheat. And you have to boil it forever, but when you cook it, it's delicious and it's chewy. And when we started getting into Whole Foods and stuff, all of a sudden people started eating it. But back in the 50s, nobody would eat it. And he would put it on plates and it would go right back to the kitchen and into the garbage. So one day he discovered he could hide it underneath a chicken breast and put a little chicken gravy on top of it. And all of a sudden the customers loved it. And you didn't give them very much because you don't need as much of a whole grain as you need of a processed grain to eat. And all of a sudden, every time the Nut Tree did something, the customers always wanted to buy it. So before you know it, you're selling this wheat out the front door. We sent thousands of bags of this wheat after he started serving this. And by that time, he had discovered that he could take tropical fruits and put California tomatoes and all of that together, and that it made an amazing mix of a plate. So he called these hot and cold plates because they were something hot in the middle, but they had a nice salad around them, and they were a less expensive option than getting a whole dinner with all the courses. You could get this and save a little money. Now, what's hysterical about this picture is that he still has the baked potato on there. If you know anything about diets, you don't need a baked potato if you're eating that wheat. But the customers, what the customer wants is what you do. That baked potato disappeared, but obviously in the early iteration, they had that. And then the last picture here was my father was a great ice cream man. He loved ice cream. He would eat it every day if he could. And he loved to experiment with toppings. And one day he decided that he would take 7 toppings and put them on a little tray, and that you could combine them in 49 different ways. And he called it the 49-way sundae. And then he asked Don Burrell to help him make it look pretty. And Don came up with these little fun flowers that actually became famous. They were the inspiration for the flower, the hippie flower that went on everything. And that became a really favorite restaurant item, and everybody's seen it go through the dining room, wanted to know what it was because that little bouquet of flowers caught their attention. We sold thousands of those paper flowers. And then he had mathematicians that would write to him and argue whether you could do 49 different combinations or not. So it created quite a little story, but that ended up being a favorite dessert item. He also liked to deconstruct pies, and in front of you, you see a huge piece of ice cream, but underneath that is a really delectable piece of pie crust that the bakery made. And under that were fresh berries that had been cooked in a microwave oven so that they were cooked fresh for every customer to order instead of baking a pie and letting it sit for days. So he was really into this kind of deconstructing things and trying to get it as fresh as possible when it got to the customer. One of his favorite things to do was to host historical society dinners. He was, because he loved history, he got involved in the Solano County Historical Society. When he was president in 1962, he said, let's host the dinner at the Nut Tree. And every year after that, he hosted a dinner for the next 20 years. And he always made a keepsake menu. And the keepsake menu was often decorated from the travels through the bookstores, the antiquarian. They're beautiful. I just gave the collection to UC Davis Library because they're really a beautiful study in farm to table as well. He always sourced the food from California and told where it was from, which you see on menus now, but it was new at that time. And it often related to the speech. So when he spoke about Drake's Bay, they also had oysters there, even though they came from Drake's Bay, where he thought Drake's landfall was San Francisco, but that's another story. But this was just an example of that. So when I talk to you tonight, I really do feel that the nut tree set the trend for Western dining and what we became known as California cuisine, where you always put fresh things and use as fresh as you can get it from the farm or your garden. And that you are inventive and that you take everything that you can possibly pull together to make this amazing culinary experience. And Nut Tree certainly did that. Let me go back to the food one more time. The Nut Tree was honored in 1986. We served almost all the presidents that came through: Nixon, Reagan. I mentioned Hoover. Eisenhower never came through. We never saw him, but we also saw a lot of the people. San Francisco had a lot of traffic going to Tahoe. So a lot of people that were singers and dancers and movie stars, Bing Crosby, all the movie stars at some point came through. There was nothing out there for 30 years. Or 60 years, there was really, 50 years, there was really nothing out there, no competition. So anyway, this last slide is kind of where I'm going to end my part about Nut Tree. And this shows everything that I didn't tell you about. I did tell you about the White House and a little bit about the architecture, but it shows the toy store and the train and everything else that was out there. It was a very family-friendly destination. And so I put that because it just reminds me. This is a picture by Sev Ikes that Don Burrell contracted with. We had a little art gallery and he contracted with these artists to make a poster, and this was made into a poster that was sold. We sold thousands of those. By the way, the dining rooms held 350 people. And actually more if you use the overflow dining rooms, and it was full every weekend. And on Mother's Day and Easter, people waited 3 hours to get into the restaurant. So now I'm going to shift just very briefly because we're starting to run out of time because we started a little late. I did not know when I started writing this book that I was going to self-publish it. I really wanted to use a publisher. My other books are published by reputable educational presses, Corwin Press or Teachers College Press out of New York. And so I really wanted to have somebody publish it, but I also wanted it to be a Northern California publisher. So I didn't want to just kind of send it out to the world because this is a California story. And I also thought that they might have some empathy for me and be interested in this story. They weren't as interested as I thought they were. So I learned a lot about self-publishing, and I thought I knew quite a bit about book publishing. And I know a lot of you here and those of you in the audience probably know this. And so some of this will be redundant to you, but the book trade, as you all know, has changed. The books my father loved to hold, he loved all your offset printing. And by the way, all those books that he collected over the years, I packed them all up 20 years after he died and gave all of those to UC Davis. So they have those archived there as well, because he loved all those little offset printing books and, some of the history books. And I gave all his Drake papers to UC Davis as well. So Davis is going to have archives of that. But the thing that I learned when I sent my first proposals out for a book was that publishers are data driven, just like the rest of the world. And that actually creates this, what I call digital silos. My book, if I had known how to pitch it, I should have pitched it as the history of the restaurant in the 20th century, a la Nut Tree. But I said history of Nut Tree. And what I learned is our family business tells the tale of restaurant trade from start to finish through the 20th century. Every piece that you could talk about restaurants is there and more. But I didn't know how to say that at that time. And they didn't want something with that narrow of a niche. It also didn't quite fit the niche because it's a business book, it's a design book, it's a hospitality book, it's partly memoir because I write about my own experience. And so they sent me lovely Heyday and 10 Speak Press, and UC Press sent me lovely rejection letters, but said, no, not the right genre for us. And Chronicle Books didn't send me anything, but that's another thing because, as we all know, those big publishers don't treat people well. So that was the end of that. And if it hadn't been for a gift from a friend, I'm not sure where I would have gone next, but a friend of mine sent a self-published book that she had done it was an autobiography that she did. And it had, when I opened it up and looked at the pictures, I was taken by the photography in this book. And what really attracted me was, of all things, a Polaroid picture. And my dad was a big Polaroid user, but those pictures fade over time. They get kind of a brown tinge to them. But this picture on the page looked like I could pick it up and hold it because it looked so realistic. And the book looked nice. It had glossy paper. And I thought, well, if I could do something close to this about Nut Tree, I could self-publish. So I called her up and said, how'd you do this? And she says, well, I have a friend that was in marketing when I worked in San Francisco, and she helped me do the layout. And then she has a printer in Oakland that she uses, and that's who printed it. And I said, well, I need to talk to this woman. And so long story short, I ended up hiring Joyce Davis, who was her book designer, and she did all the book design for this book. And the book is very Nut Tree. It's colorful. It's got pictures on every page. It's got little Nut Tree icons like that look like honey cookies. It's got the billboards. It's got everything that was Nut Tree that I could find in it. And so she was amazing with graphics, and it turned out she was amazing with photographs. And then I had enough experience with publishing that I kind of knew what I wanted. And I also have a design sense because I love art. So together we made a great team. I didn't realize at the time, but the Coast Litho with Steve and Scott Tom is one of the top publishers in this area, but they mostly publish marketing stuff. They don't do a lot of books. But what it turned out that they were using is very high gloss paper, state-of-the-art IBM machines. The dot matrix of this is 2400 by 2400. My pictures that were scanned weren't that good. So, but if you look at this, and I make a big deal of this because I want to talk to you about what's happening in publishing, these pictures look like they're photographs, and they are. They're reproduced. That's part of the reason why the price of the book is so high. It cost me a lot to print that because every single page is a color photograph just about. And but what I discovered when I went to do, and I actually ended up having to do a second printing. And when I went to do the second printing, I thought I could cut the cost because the cost seemed high at $45. And I discovered that if you go to all of these other people that do self-publications, which there's a ton of them out there, they cut corners. They don't use the good paper, and they use less ink per page, and it starts to water your photographs out, and it makes them not good. And so I have a second book that my friend Lynn wrote before she passed away about her trip to Alaska or to Australia. And she used a company called Book Baby, which is perfectly fine. And when you look at it, it looks nice. But when you start looking at the pictures, there's something wrong with them. And it's because it was cheaply done. She didn't want to spend as much money as she spent on that first book because her first book cost her more than she probably thought. Now, the good news about this for publishing is if you ever want to make your own book, it's really easy to do that. You can print, it doesn't matter. In the old days, you used to have to print 1,000 books and you could get a cut on the book. Well, it doesn't matter. One book costs the same as 50 or 100. I didn't know that, so I ordered 750 to start with. And fortunately, I've sold them all, but which is a good news thing. But there's no price cut on it anymore. And then the second thing is that you want to make sure if you have a lot of pictures and you want them to be good quality, that you pay attention to how they do that, because if you don't, you're not going to get the same quality. And so when I went looking, realized I couldn't switch. I needed to stay with this publisher, and I needed to market it myself, and I needed to ship it myself because nothing in the industry was working for me any longer. And I wasn't willing to compromise. This is a story about quality, and I can't compromise that. So that's kind of how I got to this place where I'm proud of the book. And it's digital, but it's special digital. If you go to do your own, you're going to find that you need to work with people. Now, it's not bad because most of the time you don't need state-of-the-art pictures. You know, you're just telling a story, and so it's just fine. I also want to call out to, I think it's called Arcadia Press, which is one that prints all those books you see. They're mostly brown tones about all the cities and the different places. And that they do a great service because we've captured a lot of history in this country, but they don't have good quality in them. And that's part of the reason why I didn't want to go to a company like that. So anyway, so that was the next thing I found out, was that printing has a wide, in the old days, you got whatever your publisher did. And if you work with a publisher, by the way, you get very little say over covers, layout, format, color printing, all that's managed by them, and they give you what they do. They don't let you choose. So I ended up with having great artistic license, which in the end was great fun for me. The next thing I want to say is that I thought that independent bookstores would be my friend and that I would do book talks with the independent bookstores. And it turns out that they've moved to just-in-time inventories. And what that means is that if you want to sell in an independent bookstore, you really need to self-publish through one of the companies that brokers to bookstores. And there are self-publishing companies that broker to bookstores. So if you have a book that you think is worthy of being sold, you need to find out from your independent bookseller who they work with, because that allows them to not have to have an inventory or a very small inventory. And then if you want that book, it's shipped. As you all know, we ship everything in a couple of days. So they don't have to have those inventories anymore. They all have back rooms because most of those bookstores are old, but they don't need those back rooms anymore because all of the books come in as they need them to come in. And so what I discovered is I got the Petaluma bookstore of Copperfields is one of my favorite bookstores. We have a house in Petaluma, and I had to go in and beg her to take the book because there was going to be an article in the Articus Courier about my book. And I said, it's going to break my heart if people can't come downtown and buy a book from you. Can you at least put 10 books in here, and sell them, and we'll see what happens. Well, lo and behold, I did not know it, but I became a bestseller. Well, that's a scam. What really it meant was that I sold 15 books in a 2-week period. And if you sell 15 books in any bookstore in a 2-week period, that puts you on the bestseller list. And so the newspaper actually published all the top sellers. Every 2 weeks, they publish all the top sellers. And guess what the top seller was? My little book. So I got all my teachers that I worked with back in the day sending me texts saying, your book's a bestseller. And Brene Brown's book had just come out, and hers was the next one on the nonfiction list. And I thought, oh my God, I'm up there with Brene Brown. Difference with Brene Brown is she sold 15 in every bookstore in America. I sold 15 in Petaluma. So, but that kind of, and then I just wanted to end by saying that just shows how highly manipulated the sales of books are. All those bestseller lists, all of that is all marketing. They put these people on the road every day for weeks to get the density of sales you need to get on those lists. And so, and that is running the book industry, as you probably know already. So it's hard to be an independent person, but it is. Last thing I'll say is Amazon is a necessary evil. We look at that as our bibliographic reference. And if you're not in Amazon, you don't exist. They're not friendly to small people like me. They charge an arm and a leg. My price point went up to $45 is what I sell the book for because of Amazon. They actually take over and take your price. If you try to sell it for less in a bookstore, they basically say the price is what they're selling it online for. And a book vendor told me that, but I didn't realize it till when I went to the bookstore. My SKU on the back should have said 35, which was my first price point. And it didn't at all. They just said, oh, it says your book's 45. I said, where'd that come from? I didn't tell anybody. But Amazon did. So they manipulate it all, and they're not friendly and easy to work with. They charge for every little piece of what you do, and you get no service unless you want to pay for their business model. So, which is $50 a month. So, so necessary evil, but it's what it is. So anyway, we need to go to questions because we're right at 7 and we have about 15 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to take questions in here first and then let you do in the back.
So when you sold 750 books, where did you sell it? Down?
Oh, okay, thank you. I've actually sold in 18 months, I've sold almost 1,200 books, which I'm really proud of because I didn't realize, but a lot of books don't sell more than 300. And but I sold 70 out the gate at the Vacaville Museum did a sip and sign. And because it's a local story, the books were sold at the Vacaville Museum. We didn't have enough toner. He didn't have enough toner or paper to finish the print. So I never got 750 at one time. He was printing them as fast as I sold them. The second place that I've sold a lot is through book talks like this. And a lot of times people buy more than one copy because if they have families that went to the nut tree, they want more than one. So, and then I sell about 4 or 5 a month on Amazon, and the Back of the Museum still sells. I tell people if you're going to go online to buy the book, go to Back of the Museum because they get a cut from they get a profit from it. So to Amazon, so 1996. So
and one more question.
Where
were you superintendent of schools?
I was superintendent of schools in Old Adobe School District in Petaluma, a little K-6 school district, 2,000 kids, lovely place. So anyway, she asked where my job was. I'm supposed to repeat the questions. I forgot. So.
I think you said where you.
Yeah. Okay, one more.
Why did the nut tree close?
Long story. And if you read the Chronicle, which they keep publishing, there was a suit. That's too long to go into, but the family businesses struggle. And if you read the history of family businesses, they rarely go past the third generation. And most of them last 75 years. Well, guess what? Nut Tree, I told you it was almost stereotypic for restaurant. We lasted one day short of 75 years. When you get a third generation in, there were 17 of us, too much complication. The Nut Tree was worn out. It needed to refurbished and be rebuilt. The kitchen was 49 years old. The restaurant was on top of the road. It was getting tired. Somebody mentioned that the dining room closed. You started being shoved into a corner to eat because they couldn't fill a dining room with 300. The market changed. I have an epilogue in the book, and I spent a lot of time on that because I promised my uncle when I wrote the book, I would write about all the joy that was Nut Tree and not spend a lot of time on the little bit of angst that happened at the end when the suit happened. So that the epilogue tells you more about, but really the times have changed. You don't go to a restaurant like the Nut Tree anymore. You don't find restaurants with 300 seats in them, anymore. They just don't exist. So.
We have a couple of questions on Zoom and I want to get them in here, even though we've run a little over, but that's because we started late. Can you talk a little bit about the art exhibitions and the lovely collectible posters from that?
One of the things that didn't get into the book was information about that. I would have loved to have put it in, and one of my friends in Davis chews me out every time she sees me because she loved Earl Tholender, one of the artists. And he should have been in the book. I actually have it as a project to do, but Don Burrell from the very early days found this dead space at Nut Tree. It was the ramp that you used to go into the dining room, and he decided it could be a little art gallery. And so Wayne Thiebaud was actually one of the first people he pulled to do an art show. And he knew Wayne because he had been at Crocker Art Gallery in Sacramento in the 50s, and he grew up in Sacramento. And then after that, he chose artists from all over Northern California to do it, to do these art shows. And they just put them up and they'd sell a few of them and stuff like that. And then posters became a big thing in the 60s and 70s. And they decided that they would buy one piece of art from the artist every year and make it into a poster. So that way they owned the copyright. And they really sold them as loss leaders. People paid 25 cents or a dollar for these posters, and they went everywhere. I can still find those posters in offices at UC Davis when I visit there. And I find people reframing them, and I have a few of the originals in my own home. So anyway, one of my ideas is to chronicle those pictures and try to figure out something about the history of those artists, because many of them have been lost to history because the internet didn't exist in those days. So. Great.
There is a fun question on here. What was your favorite thing on the menu that you missed the most?
I'm gonna blush. I was a picky eater, and my family had great New York steaks. So I often had a New York steak, truth be known. No, I had other things I liked. I loved the tamale. I ate the fruit, the salads a lot. I didn't like the chicken almonds so much, but I liked some of the other beef steak stew in a bread basket. I as a child, when my mom didn't want to cook, we just went and ate at the Nut Tree. So it was kind of, we ate at home a lot too, but we ate there a lot. So anyway.
And then we'll close with the question about what was the most surprising thing to you during the research about your family and about the Nut Tree that you discovered in the process?
There were so many surprises because there were unanswered questions that I didn't really know. I guess I'm going to say the thing that was most interesting to me is Alan Hess, who is an architect and has written books in his own right, wrote on a Facebook post that he thought the Nut Tree was one of the most iconic mid-century designs that he'd ever seen. And he put the picture I have in the book of the bird cage, the aviary that we had. And he said that was just like amazing. So I reached out to my sister, sent it to me, and I reached out to him and said, why do you say that? Because I was trying to figure out this modernity thing. How would we get there? And I started telling him about how my family all lived in these modern houses before Don Burrell got there. And he asked me, how did that happen? And at the same time, I went down to the Oakland Museum to see the Charles and Ray Eames exhibit. And there were all these architectural architects, and it was a magazine from the 40s that the case study challenge was put into. Case study challenge was to take technology from World War II and to put it into homes to build low-cost housing for all of these GIs coming back from the war, and to use products that we had developed for the war, like aluminum, doors and, metal doors and sliders and things like that. And because California didn't have as much trouble with weather, you didn't have to put all this insulation and stuff. And so that was probably the biggest surprise, was to figure out that the toy shop is actually a riff on the Charles and Ray Eames case study house. That was like a big aha for me to figure out. And my uncle had told me he had gone down there and looked at that house and walked all around it, but I didn't put it together until I was writing the book. And that was it was like, oh, here's my link, here's how it happened. So.
Yeah, do you have a slide that talks about getting the book?
Oh, yeah, thank you. I forgot about that. The best way to get the book is I will sell it for $49. That includes tax and shipping, which is less than if you buy it from the other vendors. If you write directly to me, you can buy it if you're here tonight, but if you're not here, you can write directly to me. Just put a check for $49 in an envelope. Make sure you put your name and your address. And then if you would like to have it inscribed with anybody's name, I've already signed them, but if you want them inscribed, tell me how to inscribe it. And then I ship every few days because I have to ship. Amazon also makes you ship like immediately. You can't wait to ship for Amazon. So you have to work it into your day. So it's not hard for me to ship. I've got that down now finally. So anyway, so that would be how. And I also have a web link. That is, I have a website that's www.iconicnuttree.com. So those of you that are home, if you want to look it up right now, you can see some of the pictures. You can see a little bit of peek inside my book because I don't have that on Amazon, because I don't have it on Kindle, because of the pictures is mostly why.
And I'll send that information out to everyone who registered to attend virtually. So you'll have the contact information, you'll have that website, you'll have the address if you're interested in buying the book and how to do that. So you can get that.
My email is also there, so anybody's welcome to send questions. As you can see, I could talk about it forever. So
and you could always contact me and ask me, how do I contact the author, or how do I get the book, and I will let you know.
Thank you. You guys were a great audience.
So thank you again for joining us this evening, and thanks to our presenter, Diane Power Zimmerman. Please join us for our next in-person and virtual program, which will be here in San Francisco on Monday, September 18th, in 1 week. Is that right? Yeah, that's 1 week. The program is titled From Books to Bites, Building the Next Generation of the Bancroft Library Collections. Our speaker is going to be Kate Donovan. She is the director of the Bancroft Library and the Associate University Librarian for Special Collections at UC Berkeley. That program is co-hosted and co-presented by the Northern California chapter of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America. So check it out. You can go online to bccbooks.org/programs to register for that event, or you can respond to the emails that you're probably getting from the book club now. There's always a link to register for an upcoming program. So thank you again for joining us here in the club rooms and online. Thank you for your patience. We still never got the Wi-Fi connected for our sound system, but we did not lose the Wi-Fi connection for the production and the broadcast. So we're good. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon here at the book club. Thank you.
Thank you.